Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Veblen. Today, I'm going to be talking about controlling seam allowances, and part of that is how to make a facing that stays in place, because that's a seam here, a seam allowance around our neck or wherever the facing might be. I'm happy to bring you this information, and I hope it helps you bring your sewing skills up a little bit. And even if you're accustomed to doing these things, maybe you'll pick up a tip or two. I hope so. I'll start by sharing my screen, and we'll first be talking about some different seam allowances and how I control them. Here is a raglan sleeve blouse. I'm using my cursor here. You can see the raglan seams here, and it has a facing for the neck and some sewn on flounces, center front opening, of course. And there is the garment from the side, just so you have a feeling for what we're talking about. And here you can see the flounce detail. I used just a rolled hem on a serger without rolling it, so it's really quite flat for the outside edge of the flounce, because I have so many different grain lines, and I happen to like that kind of raw. It's not completely raw looking, but it's more of a raw look, unfinished, not turned and turned again or finished very fancily. So here's the garment from the wrong side. So I'm sitting on my dress form, and you can see the facing sitting here, coming in the outer edge of the facing. And I have used a 3-thread configuration on my serger to clean finish this edge. So I applied the inner facing, sewed the front and back facing together, applied to the neckline, and at some point in that process, I clean finished. I usually clean finish all in one, meaning after I have sewn the shoulder seam of the facing. So I can go start here at the bottom of the front and go up all the way around and then back down, so that that's all completely clean finished. On the neck facing, I'll go into facings in more detail, bring this up in size, and you can see my understitching. Of course, we can only go so far into the so close to the front of the garment with our understitching. I understitch from the top, so the seam allowances are down against the machine, and I stitch from the top. That gives me the best results. And so even though I would sew my facing on directionally, starting at the center back and coming around, starting again at the center back and coming around, when I understitch all in one direction. So here is that close-up of the neck understitching. You can see it a little bit better. Sometimes here on the serge finish of the facing edge, I will use a narrow configuration. This is a wide configuration. The rayon was a little bit wiggly, so I wanted some more stability. All of these things are conscious decisions. They aren't just, oh, I'll do this. That's how my machine is set up, but I think about all of these things. And here is the top of the raglan sleeve. And you can see that I have pressed these seam allowances open. And I refer to that very often as butterflying the seams, because the butterfly wings spread open like this. I will show you in another shot that I have tacked the facing down to these seam allowances. And in fact, I have it every seam allowance that occurs around the neckline, just to help keep the facing in place. It would stay there on its own quite nicely because of the steps I take in the construction of the facing, which I will show you in a few minutes. But because this garment was going to go through the wash, I wanted to make sure that it was held down in more places. Because this is a rayon, after it goes through the laundry, I do have to give it some pressing. And I very often start by pressing on the wrong side of the garment so I can butterfly, press open my seams again, and press any seam in the direction I want it to be going in. So here you can see that on the raglan seam, I've pressed that seam allowance up, and that's because it's the direction it wants to go in. If I tried to press it down, I could get it to go that way, but it naturally wants to go up. So I often pay attention to that. Here, where I have a join in the facing at the raglan sleeve juncture, the facing, of course, is pressed open to reduce bulk. In the rayon, this isn't, the raglan seam in the garment is not producing much bulk. In heavier fabric, I might do it differently, but I would experiment with that particular fabric. And so here you can see the back raglan is also pressed up. Everything is tacked down nicely. And here is the side seam coming down to the hem, and it is butterflied. So all of this is how I'm thinking about pressing, what direction I'm going to press my seams, how I'm going to do it. Of course, your pressing is multiple steps. You sew the seam. Sometimes I'll press as sewn, just flat, but then I'll use a finger press with my fingers, just encourage the seam to come open, then press from the wrong side, and then I'll turn the work over and press from the right side. Those steps are really important. And here is the flounce, and you can see that the flounce seam allowance pressed, I have it pressed up, because if I tried to press it down, I'm fighting against the fullness here. So a lot of this is me just seeing what the seam allowance, what the area wants to do. And I know that may sound funny to you to say, well, what does fabric want to do? But in this case, we have multiple layers here. Pressing up is what the bulk of the fabric, and it's not very bulky, wants to do. This is China silk that has been pre-washed. And so that combined with the rayon is not bulky, but it is coming back on itself. And it definitely wanted to press up. If I tried to press it down, it just popped back up in the other direction. And here is the center back seam butterflied, and then the hem brought up over it. And here is showing you where my facings are tacked. I've talked a little bit about it. I have some tacking here. I use a catch stitch to tack. That's one of my favorite hand sewing stitches. It's very effective. You can work it large, you can work it small, and it's very strong. And it too balances the shift. I don't know if you sometimes are sewing, I'll stop sharing my screen, but you're sewing something with a whip stitch, and say you're sewing a facing or a hem, and you find that that hem or facing crawls in the direction you're whip stitching. And with a catch stitch, that never happens, which is one of the reasons I really like it. Once you get used to forming it, it goes very, very quickly. So I've catch stitched at the center back, at the back raglans, across the center of the sleeve seam on the raglan, and then on the front raglans as well. It keeps everything nice and in order. So here I'm just showing you, putting my finger up under there, how that's tacked down, some little tiny catch stitches in there. And on my side seam of this raglan, on many of my raglans, I sew the side seam and underarm seam all in one. And you can see that that's what I've done. And then I can press it open to balance the bulk. Sometimes I'll use a catch stitch to hold this seam allowance to the front raglan seam, and then this seam allowance to the back raglan seam. But with raglans, this configuration can be a little bit wonky, not a very technical term, but it gets bulky and odd in there. So if I go to make some stitches to catch stitch the side seam allowance to the raglan seam, if I feel like I'm having to force something, I might not do it. But if it naturally wants to go down, I certainly would consider doing that. So let's look at just some samples. I think making samples is a wonderful thing to do. I make a lot of samples, especially if I'm working in a fabric that I'm not familiar with. I very often will make a couple of samples, perhaps this size, perhaps even smaller. Once I've cut my garment out, I often have a bunch of scrap fabric that then I can use to make some little samples to check how I want to handle the seam allowance. It does not need to be this big, but I certainly, could have it narrower, and I would want at least 2 or 3 inches of length in the seam. And if you are cutting out your garment on the length of grain, which we usually do, so the pattern's grain line arrows are going along the length of grain of the fabric, be sure to do your samples with the same grain direction of the fabric, unless, of course, you're trying to test what stitching on the cross grain would be. So here is an example of a butterflied seam, pressed open, finger pressed first, and then pressed open with iron from the wrong side, turned over and pressed open pressed again from the right side. Here are the seam allowances pressed to one side. And here we have trimming the seam allowances. And very often we want to get rid of some of the width. If I am pressing open, I am really careful about trimming my seam allowances too close, because a small seam allowance very often pops back up. It won't stay in place as nicely. And when I have made the decision that I'm going to trim my seam allowances, it's a very conscious decision. Even if pattern instructions tell me to, or if they don't, I might make the other decision just from some samples and thinking through the scenario of the garment. But there are times we do want to reduce this bulk width of the seam allowance, in which case you can trim. Here I am holding my scissors upright, so it's a straight cut. Here I am holding my scissors at an angle, which will give me a beveled cut, meaning that the bottom layer of the seam allowance is going to be very slightly shorter than the upper layer. I might also trim the two seam allowances separately, one at a time, and have whichever one, if I'm pressing to one side, whichever side gets pressed towards the garment is to be the longer seam allowance. The shorter one is against the body. So the longer one that's against the garment masks the shorter one, so you don't get a ridge. So here is a trimmed seam allowance sample. And now I want to talk to you about sewing facings. This is really important. I'm going to give you a number of little tips that have served me well over the years. I don't have pins here. You might have it pinned. This was a small sample. It's a stable cotton, so I didn't have any trouble with it. And I sew with relatively few pins most of the time, unless I'm in a situation that I really need it. For one thing, you can see that I use a piece of tape for a seam allowance guide. And where you want to look, if the needle is coming down here, where you want to be guiding the fabric is about 1/8 of an inch in front of the needle, right along your guide. So when you go into a curve, a lot of times people say to me, well, where do I look? Come to the needle, go over to your seam allowance guide, and come up just the ittiest bit forward, 1/16, maybe an eighth, no more than 1/8 of an inch, but not necessarily right in alignment with that needle, tiny, tiny bit in front. And when you are sewing a facing, be sure, if it's a neck facing, many of our facings have curved seams, be sure to sew in a curve. Note how I have the fabric here. It is following the configuration of the garment, and I'm going to sew this, sew, and keep rotating the fabric gently in that curve. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. And so if the fabric is coming out like this, I'll have my hands here and I'll do this. It's a motion of keeping that curve. You don't want to pull this down and make the curve straight, because a straight seam is shorter than a curved seam, and very often then you are going to have trouble with keeping your facing flat. It'll want to pop up out of shape, out of its correct position. So here is an example of what not to do. Do you see how I'm moving that curve so it's a straighter shot? You do not want to do that. You want to keep everything in that nice curve and use your hands to feed it gently and slowly under the feed dog in that curved shape. Once you get used to doing it, it's quite nice. And to me, it's second nature. So if you have a habit of straightening your curved edges out when you're applying a facing, really try to break that habit. You'll be so happy when your facings lay flatter. Now here I'm only doing a little bit of a sample, so we don't have a shoulder seam and a complete facing. But here you can see that I've trimmed out the seam allowance. I started with about 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. When I trim out about half of that seam allowance. I generally don't trim down any further than that unless I have bulky, well, even on bulky fabric, I don't. Sometimes on a sheer fabric, I will trim a little bit closer. But if you trim too far down, you may actually have more trouble controlling the seam allowance within the neck area, or wherever it is that you're applying the facing. It could be a waist area or a hem. And so you want to leave, to me, a good 1/4 of an inch of facing most of the time, maybe a tiny bit more than that. And then if you want to, you can grade your seam allowance. Now you can see that this is a little bit narrower. The facing is what is going to get pressed back against the garment is longer, always. I generally don't grade my seam allowances unless I use a beveled cut, but there are instances, especially where I have bulky fabric, that I will grade. Now, if I went to turn my facing into place and press it again, you can see as soon as I start to manipulate the fabric, do you see that this area right in here in the curve is starting to curl up? It's not laying flat. Here's laying flat. Here I'm getting a curl in it. And that tells me that I need to clip my facing seam allowance. And that's because of what I refer to as the donut effect. If we have a donut here, we have the donut hole in here. This circumference out here is bigger than this circumference. So when we apply a facing like this and it comes back around, where the seam allowance is going to end up resting. Let me get back to my pictures. Where this is going to rest, it's going to be an even greater differential. Excuse me. And so it's really important to clip your seam allowance. In the curved areas, you want to clip it more. And so my clips in this scenario are about 3/8 of an inch apart, maybe in this curved area a little bit closer. And any place that I see is kind of straining, where the clips are straining open, then I'll go back in and clip closer together. It's more important to have more clips, in my experience, than deeper clips. I usually clip to within about 1/8 of an inch of the seam allowance, of the seam line, sometimes a tiny bit more than that, but I don't want to get too close to that seam line. The clipping is super important. And you can see even up in this area that's relatively flat, I still have clipped a little bit. It's better to clip a little bit too much than not enough. And then I will understitch. And so I have the seam allowances down. Oh, let me qualify this. Then I will press with the iron, and I will usually press from the right side. So I will have this flipped over onto the surface of the ironing board. I often press on a ham, and I'll make sure that my seam allowances are coming towards the facing, all of the seam allowances coming towards the facing. And when I am pressing, I will have the facing in a different configuration. I will have it turned the other way, so it's coming out this direction. So the garment is in its natural configuration, and I'll use just the little point of the iron to come up, and I want to press this direction where the garment, where I'm pressing in towards the facing, going to the facing. That will help really open this seam up. As I'm doing the pressing, here I'm showing a shot of sewing, of understitching, but when I'm doing the pressing, if I feel a strain, I'll go back in and clip it some more. But once you have pressed, and that's a really important step, and I make sure that all my seam allowances are coming towards the facing. Then when I go to understitch, I want the garment to be in configuration with the facing. The garment here is kind of bubbled up. What's important is that we are in the configuration of the facing, and I will understitch from this right side, the public side, well, it's the inside of the garment, but that's what's up. The seam allowances are down, and I want to stitch in a curve, just like we sewed the facing onto the garment. We want to maintain that curve. So I'll be moving the fabric up and around, keeping the curve, always being careful to be looking right here as I stitch. And here you can see what you do not want to do, where I have the garment more in its configuration, and you can see the facing is making these bubbles because of it being curved. No, this is not what you want to do. You want to have it in this configuration. I think sometimes it's helpful to see what not to do so that you have a really good visual. You always want that facing in its proper configuration when you are going to do your understitching. And so here is my understitching. I have done everything in contrasting colors so that you can see it, the garment being pink, the facing being white, and then a dark thread. And I usually stitch not too close to that seam line, because the point of the understitching is to catch the seam allowances. And so I stitch about a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch away or so. It depends on how closely I've trimmed my seam. But sometimes I see people where they have understitched really, really, really close to the seam line. And to me, that doesn't do very much. The point of the understitching is to keep the seam allowances connected, attached to the facing. And so I like to stitch a little bit further away. And then when I go to turn the facing into its natural configuration, bringing it back, this is before I have pressed it. The facing literally falls into place. And what I am going to want when I press it is to favor the facing to the garment. So I have just this little tiny bit of garment fabric showing when I'm looking at the facing side. So when I do my pressing of the facing, this is the configuration I have it in. And I want just the tiniest bit of garment fabric showing. This is too much, but this is what we want. But the point of this picture is all as I did here was turn the facing back, and it almost always pretty automatically falls into place. If it's bubbling up and wanting to flip out, then especially in a curved area, then I would take the understitching out, clip your curves some more, and then stitch again. One of the reasons I love making facings, and it's something, who knows how many hundreds of facings I've ever sewn, but I love doing it because it turns out beautifully every single time if you follow all of these little tiny steps. And so here where I am pressing, you can see I have just this tiniest bit of garment. I'm favoring the facing to the inside of the garment, and I press coming around. I use my fingers a lot when I am manipulating the fabric here. Fabric has kind of a memory, and so when you've pressed it into place, it's remembering that to some greater or lesser degree. And so my fingers are really important to me. I often will have them feel along here, feel that it's nice and flat, that I have eyes are seeing that I have a consistent amount of garment fabric showing. And sometimes I'll have a little bit more garment fabric and I'll just use my fingers to slightly push, very gently push that way, while to get less garment fabric showing, and then do my pressing. This is not fast for me. It takes me a little bit of time to do it, but I love doing it. I love seeing this come into shape. And there it is pressed. And you can see that the facing is just laying beautifully, and you can see that little tiny, I think of it as like a little bead of garment fabric. That's what you want. You will never be able to see the facing in this garment from the right side if all of your steps are done correctly. And there it is shown from the right side. Of course, since I stitched in dark thread, you can see that dark thread shadowing through the fashion fabric, but you can see that you don't see any of the facing fabric in here. It's just nice and hidden because it's being favored to the wrong side of the garment. And then I have one more section that I want to go over with you, and that is just to show you some garments and talk about them, about what I did for different seam allowances, and how I controlled them. And I've got a variety of different kinds of fabrics and garments to show you. And even though some of the garment types might not be what you're interested in sewing out of because of my fabric choice or style choice, hopefully you'll still get some tips here. So here is a cotton blouse of mine that I made, and you can see that I have some shaping in my side seam, just a little bit of shaping, i.e. it's a curve here. And in order to be able to press these seam allowances open, I had to clip my curves. And I didn't realize that until I had until I started construction. Typically what I do is cut out my garment, clean finish all of the edges with a 3-thread narrow serger configuration. And when I do that, I cut off only little stray threads. I don't take down any width of the seam allowance, so I know I can sew at my designated seam allowance. I very often use 5/8. But when I went to press this, because of the curvature in the side seam, I had to clip it. Otherwise, what I kept finding happened was that seam, the side seam, is like this. Instead of it laying out completely flat, I can't get my hands to do it in that direction. Instead of laying flat, they tended to pop back up. And so when I was ironing, pressing, and I could feel that cut edge, the finished serged edge, there was tension on it, that's what told me I really needed to clip the curves. I don't like to do this in a garment that has been finished like this, but it is what it is. You live and learn. After this goes through the laundry, I do have to press it again, and you can see over time, because of clipping through those serger threads, the threads are starting to fray out. Now what I do when I make this pattern is I will cut the garment out, and I will sew my side seam, and I will clip. And then after it is clipped and the seam is sewn and the seam allowances are clipped where it's needed, then I'll go back and serge finish the cut edge. Again, I usually don't take off any width, but that means that when I serge, I can just serge directly over those clips where they're spreading apart. And that these clips are spreading tells me we definitely need to be clipping. So one thing that's really nice about a serger is it is happy to stitch in air. It'll go over these clips perfectly fine and stay in place in those little short sections of stitching in air. This is a sleeve that I developed, and my seam allowances at my armhole, always go into the sleeve cap. There are very few exceptions of that. You want that seam allowance filling the sleeve cap here, and it will help hold your sleeve nicely and give it a little bit of shape. In the neckline, even though I had was meticulous in putting my basting my collar on and then applying my facing, it wanted to roll a little. The neck edge was not happy. It did not behave itself the way I wanted it to. So I went back in and top stitched the facing down in place. This took me a while to do because I brought the collar up, and then I made sure that the seam allowance, the fashion fabric and the facing fabric were really laying nice 1-to-1, and then put it with it pinned that way, put it on a dress former myself and made sure that the collar laid nicely. And then I went back in and top stitched. And you don't see the top stitching from the public side because it's sitting up in here. And so the collar covers it. And you can see I ended that top stitching before I got to the too close to where the collar cuts back. I didn't want to run the risk of that top stitching showing. This surprised me that I needed to do it, but the collar is a roll collar. I have a little bit of a stand here. The facing I really thought would hold it in place, but because of the different layers that I accumulated in the collar, as well as between the garment and the facing and the collar, that's where the collar is sandwiched. It was just one of those things, and you just accept it and go, okay, well, what can I do? And this was an easy solution to hold that facing in place so that it didn't roll out. Here's a different garment, and I have some arm side princess seams in it. This is an arm side princess seam, and you can see here I have butterflied that seam, and I had had to clip it. I have again that same mistake. I had already serged, clean finished it, and then I had to clip through it. This garment has been worn and washed dozens and dozens of times. And in retrospect, I wish I had pressed this differently, because you can see I had to clip the seam allowance that's going upward, and the one coming downward kind of scrunches up on itself. And I could have clipped out some corners, some little triangles to help it lay flat, but it was a soft cotton blouse. And in retrospect, what I wish I had done was to press the seam allowances up and then serge finish them together, because you can see all of this just lays in much nicer. I'm not fighting anything. When I tried to press it down, this was all after the fact. I was just thinking it through after I had worn it any number of times. And then when I was preparing this lecture, I thought, well, I could press it down. But you can see I'm really fighting with that. Whereas here, the fabric was happy to go up without fighting. So in retrospect, I will recap. I would have cut the garment out, sewn this princess seam, pressed it into its configuration, both seam allowances coming up, and then serge finished the two together before I set the sleeve in and finalize the construction. So it's a matter of listening to the fabric. Here are flat fell seams, and I am not a big flat fell seamer. They are very efficient to do certain jobs. I find them a little tedious, but there are times it's exactly what is the best thing to do. The reason I used it on this is it's a linen that was tended to ravel a lot. And the flat fell seam is a little less bulky than a French seam. And because of the style of the skirt, I was happy to have the top stitching that ends up showing in a flat fell seam. So here you can see that flat fell seam sitting here. And here it is from the inside of the garment. So that's one thing that's nice about a flat fell seam, is it is quite finished from both the inside and the outside of the garment. Here's a bias dress that I did for one of my daughters. And here you can see the side seam I have serge finished. One thing to know about the bias is it rarely frays. And so if the garment's not going to be worn a lot, you can sometimes just leave it unfinished at all. But the seam allowances, I serged them together. But so I had constructed and then pressed them to one side and serged them. But where her zipper opening is, which is on her side seam, I believe, you can see I had to make that transition. So the upper part of the seam is butterflied for the zipper, and then I transition into the seams allowances being pressed to one side and serge finished together. This is a silk broadcloth, but it's not super heavyweight. Here is one more garment to take a couple more garments for us to look at. Here is a wool skirt. I know this is kind of dark. I apologize. But it has this interesting detail where we have a center front seam, and then the edges are brought back and held in place just as a design element. And so here is a close-up of that so you can see it. We put a button here in part because this is a really snarky little area to have it look exactly flat and clean. And so because we have this edging here showing with the facing coming, this is the wrong side of the fabric coming back, and we have this edged to give it with flat piping to give it some pizzazz. And so we've got a lot of layers in here. And so in this case, sometimes you think, well, I'll just make a decorative element. I like the buttons in here. The fabric, as you can see, is pink and green, and the buttons are too, which was fun. And I knew I was going to need buttons to hold these little edges, points back in place anyway. And there is the garment from the wrong side, where you can see we actually used a few little hand stitches up underneath here to catch. So I worked them, so we brought them not coming all the way through the public side, now the public side of the garment, but just enough to kind of hold that in place. So there are times when you're doing something like this that you just have to jump in and get started and see what it is you have to do. Let the fabric, as you are working with it, help dictate these things. Here I've pulled these little seam allowances and tucked them back under and given a few little stitches to hold that in place, so that I didn't have a funky raw edge there. So the inside of the garment, I wanted it to look as clean as possible, knowing that it wouldn't be completely clean. So this is the final edge of the garment. Here, what we're just seeing the garment, the back of the garment, with the garment is inside out, and we're just seeing the back of the garment there. But this is that opening right in here that we're looking at. Here is a dress that I made. I've made this any number of times, and because of the configuration of this seam, there's the front of the garment, and here is the back. And so these, the empire comes down across the side seam all the way down to the back point. And in the construction, this is much easier to sew your center front and center back seams continually. So that's continuous rather than trying to make that point turn sewing the skirt to the bodice. So sometimes we have to think about what is going to facilitate our construction and then make choices about our seam allowance accordingly. This has a little bit of a liner. It has a lining to it, but there you can see my seam allowances being pressed open. And then one final garment here. This is just a t-shirt. And in the t-shirt, I wanted to point this out because a lot of people do serger construction on knits. And you can see that I do too in some places, but not in all of the places. So here you can see I clean finished my shoulder seams with a 3-thread configuration on the serger, just clean finished, sewed the shoulder seam, pressed it open, and then I constructed the sleeve to the bodice. And that means that I have far less bulk in the neckline, whatever treatment I choose to make, and where the sleeve gets attached to the garment. A lot of times if you've serge finished that shoulder seam, that means you've got the two seam allowances together and they're going backwards, or usually to me, I would press them towards the back. And then when you attach the sleeve and go to finish the neckline, it becomes quite bulky. Whereas if you butterfly the seam, you've distributed the bulk and balanced it. So to me, I am often thinking about these things and what down the road in the construction is going to facilitate it. I used to always serge construct my shoulder seams, and then I was doing some neck finish at some point. I thought, oh my gosh, this is so bulky. And I decided, well, what I should do is go back in and, or in the future renditions of the same pattern or on all of my knits, maybe I should keep my shoulder seams butterflied open, which is what I do most of the time now. Sometimes I serge finish my knits at the shoulder seam, and some knits lay nice and flat, and I don't even bother to serge finish them. If they tend to curl, I do serge finish them just to help control that knit that tends to want to curl. So here you can see I've serge finished my side seam that then goes up into my underarm seam. So I do a flat construction on most of my knits, where I sew the shoulder seam, apply the sleeve to the garment. Here you can see I have used a 4-thread serger configuration to serge construct, and then I sew my front and back side seam and underarm sleeve seam all in one pass. You will note here too that when at the intersection of the side seam and the sleeve, I've flipped the seam allowance. So generally speaking, as I said earlier, and it's true for knits, I press the seam allowance of this body of the garment and the sleeve, that seam, I would press it towards the sleeve, but then just in this one little area as I am crossing the seam under the sleeve, the seam that joins the sleeve to the bodice, when I'm doing this type of serge construction, you can see I flip that one seam allowance down so that then I am balancing the bulk of the seam. This is pressed down and this is pressed up, so that then I have a little bit of thickness, but it's balanced. I don't have all of this coming up on both sides, which really produces a lot of bulk. So just think through what will help you on different parts of your garment. For the last thing, I just want to show you some sheer garments in case you like to work on some sheers. And sheers pose their own set of issues, but you can see I have used French seam, and then when I was applying this little cuff here, I turned it under so everything is enclosed. I don't have any raw edges showing there. This part of the pants is silk charmeuse, and so I've used more of my standard construction, butterflied the seams, and you can see my catch stitch for the hem here. So I'm working in an ensemble with different fabrics, but different parts of the garment are going to get treated differently. Here in the vest that is a sheer fabric, I have used French seams, and here in the tunic, I used a French seam that then splits into a turn and turn again. That transition is always going to be a tiny bit funky when you do that. And sometimes I just think if it looks too funky, then I'll think, okay, I'll put a little decorative element there. So that could be a button, or if you like something more a little bit different and bring the fabric back into it with a scrap of fabric, you could have cut out one of these motifs and somehow finish that edge or leave it unfinished and apply it there. So you can cover up that spot. But just know when you have these types of transitions, sometimes they get really funky and there's nothing you can do about it. And so either it's okay with you as it is, or then you cover it up with a design element. But always when you do that, keep in mind that you want your design element to make sense. So I hope these examples of how I've handled different seam allowances, how I apply a facing, and how I then get the facing to lay nice and flat. I hope it has been helpful to you. I really encourage you to think through each and every garment you make, as well as each garment component. Just because you've decided you're going to, say, on a knit, do serge construction, that doesn't mean you have to do it throughout. You can pick and choose where you're going to do it. And within a garment itself, a woven garment, there may be areas where you use one type of seam and in another area a different type of seam. And that's perfectly fine. It's all about getting the results that you want and figuring out how to control the seam allowances. I hope this helps. Bye-bye.